Hello and welcome. I'm Kallie, one of the instructors at the Songwriting School Online, and today's video is going to be on the topic of preparing your computer for audio. We're first going to start with a little history about recording, so this will be a multi-part video. Alright, so let's get started. Let's talk about the history of recording, starting with the earliest recordings that were made by devices to capture and analyze sound waves. These devices were capable of recording sounds long before the phonograph. Leon Scott invented the phonoautograph in 1857. These early recording devices were usually based off a horn, which had a flexible diaphragm at one end and then a stylus attached to the other end. The stylus scratched a line on a rotating cylinder beneath it. So out of this technology, we then see the invention of devices like the phonograph, the gramophone, and the graphophone. These types of devices remained in use, which were purely mechanical, right into the 1920s. So by purely mechanical, I mean there's no electricity necessarily required. In 1924, Columbia began experimenting with a recorder that used electronic amplifiers to drive electromagnetic cutting heads instead of acoustic horns. These were transcription recorders, and they used electromagnetic cutting heads, which carried this out in a lathe-like mechanism, which you can see in the bottom picture here. Now, these early days were fraught with issues of trying to sync sound to picture. Soon, sound on film, as opposed to sound on disc technologies, became to replace the technologies as early as 1929. This became the standard for film and movies through all the way till the 1980s, and it's sometimes still in use today. Now, Germany and England were pioneers in much of the development of early tape, and in the 1920s, saw the introduction of oxide-coated tape in place of wires and bands, which led to significant improvements in sound quality. Germany took the lead in innovating its tape recorder and plastic recording mediums, and this was the first time that people were really able to have long recordings and recordings under conditions where there might be vibrations or shock, something like a drum kit perhaps. And it was also popular for field recording as a result. This technology was called the AEG magnetophone, and it was developed in Germany in the early 1930s all the way into 1945. Much like modern tape, it used this fine iron powder coating. And this brings us to tape recording. In 1948, the first consumer tape recorders hit the market, and they were really very successful. During the 1950s, there was a boom in consumers owning these types of devices. Record companies of the day were willing to sell these recorded tapes, but they couldn't compete with how cheap LPs were. This should sound sort of familiar, similar to things that we're having today. We have poor quality, which beats the sales of the higher quality sounding recordings in something like MP3 versus CDs. Now, recording studios could now use tape to make it seem like performers were accompanying themselves during the recording process. And remember, this wasn't always possible. We really take this for granted. With the tape, if there was a mistake, it could be edited out or recorded over. And again, it was really changing how music was being made and thought about. Increasingly, these practices became widely used and more complex, and some of the recordings of the 1960s took full advantage of these practices. More and more tracks could be added to recorders to allow 24 or more tapes to be recorded in a single go. This was pretty wide tape. And this brings us to home listening, of course. So the first stereo recordings were available to the public as reel-to-reel tape, if you can imagine. However, in 1957 and 1958, RCA introduced tape that allowed for 4 tape heads to be stacked so that the stereo tape could be flipped over and played on both sides. It was also more compact. These 4-track tapes were not compatible with other types of tape players of the day, and because of the higher price of these stereo tapes, they fell out of popularity. Now, at the same time, RCA were also pioneering stereo LP records. And because of this, for many years, you could buy both stereo and mono recordings of the same record, as they were not compatible on the same players, of course. And during the 1960s, many record companies discontinued the mono stuff. So from 1958 to the mid-1960s, many tape systems for cars were developed. 8-track recordings peaked around the 1970s. These tapes had lower quality sound, but required no rewinding and played automatically. It was really intended to be simple, so it wouldn't distract drivers, for example. From here we see the start of the cassette, and it was originally intended to be a children's technology developed by Philips. Ray Dolby pioneered a lot of the hiss reduction technology during this time, and mostly for reel-to-reel recorders for studios. Cassettes quickly became popular amongst teens and people who wanted to copy their records, their LPs, to tape. And this also led to Walkman players for cassettes, which led to Discman players, and later to our present-day MP3 players. So how have computers changed our recording process? With the introduction of computers into the recording studio, there were several layers of change occurring. Editing was drastically changed. Instead of editing tape, there were many new possibilities for editing on the computer. This, of course, was dependent on the computer's processing power, which we'll discuss in a little bit. Along with editing the computer, this allowed for the data to be stored differently. This means that there was no longer the work of many people being stored on a shelf, but onto a drive. At first, this was slow, and many people were resistant to this gradual change. People were suspicious of not being able to patch around a problem. What would happen, for example, if the computer crashed? There's no patching around that. Now, however, as technology improved, so too did the capabilities of computers in terms of editing, storage, digital signal processing, and much more. Previously, there were many people involved in typical recording sessions. An engineer, a producer, a second engineer, a tape operator, maybe even possibly a session assistant or an intern. With the dissolution of the use of tape, tape op was no longer needed, and in many cases, only a very savvy engineer and maybe an assistant were needed in some cases. This meant also that along with fewer roles and fewer jobs, there were more soft costs in terms of technology, which changed faster and obsoleted faster. Technology even now is changing faster and faster, so what was once an expensive amount of storage is now possible maybe even on your mobile phone. Speaking of mobile, now we are seeing even more change. So think on just how many possibilities there are as DAWs are able to record and edit on things like tablets and mobile phones. The accessibility of the everyday consumer has changed the playing field completely. It's more or less important these days to think about yourselves differently as you enter into the market, creating your own content. Many musicians like yourselves are trying to tackle recording on their own, so it's important that we consider how your recording capabilities factor in to an already diverse playing field. And this brings us to the question of hard drives. So what does a hard drive do? It's primarily responsible for storing digital information in a fairly permanent form. It allows your computer to store information even when the power's off. Thank goodness. Hard drives store information much the same way that magnetic tape does. So information can be erased, rewritten, and as the disk remembers the magnetic flux pattern that is stored onto the medium. So this is why it's really important not to put our hard drives on top of things like magnets, right? Or storing your laptop near a hard drive if you have an external one. So data is stored on the hard drive in form of files. And more specifically, this is a collection of bytes that's spelled with a Y. Typically, when a program on a computer runs, it requests information from a file. and the hard drive retrieves it in bytes, and these are then sent to the CPU. We'll talk about CPU soon. HDD, hard drive, performance is measured in a couple of ways: data rate, seek time, and capacity of the drive. Now, data rate is the number of bytes per second that the drive can deliver to the CPU. Seek time is the amount of time between the CPU requesting the files and when the first byte of the file is sent to the CPU. Capacity is simply the number of bytes it can hold. Never, ever open a hard drive while it is running. This will automatically damage your hard drive. Hard drives don't like to be shaken or jostled while running. Remember that the disk is spinning, so just like a CD or a record, it can skip. In this case, the resulting skip can cause problems. Things like taking a laptop or an external hard drive on a laptop, for example, can cause the drive to become quite jostled, and even connections in the computer can be loosened. So take great care in transporting these devices. Lastly, it's absolutely vital that you shut down your computer and restart it from time to time. Simply sleeping your computer all the time doesn't give your hard drive the adequate rest that it needs to refresh. It's always a good idea to restart your computer after any updates or new installations of software. And at the end of your day in the studio or at home, always power down. Never unplug a spinning drive. This concludes part 1. Our second part of this tutorial will talk about hard drive and audio specifications and how they come together. I hope this has been informative, and I look forward to discussing the rest of our materials with you in part 2.